So good morning, everybody. My name's Gemma McGregor, and I am one of the Provider Development Officers at NCFE, and I mainly support T-level providers who are delivering the education and early years T-level, but my background is in assessment and higher education in terms of teacher training. And this session this morning is all going to be around unpicking assessment objectives and how you can use those assessment objectives to best support your student. So I'm joined this morning by my colleague Rachel Webster, who's also part of the provider development team. If you want to shout up and say hi, Rachel.
Good morning, everybody. I'm just
Lovely. Thanks, Rachel. Thanks so much. There's still a few people joining. So as we do the introductions, I'll just let people join as we go. We've also got our colleague, Beth Hudspeth, who's also part of the provider development team. And she's in the background monitoring the chat as well. So you'll probably have spotted her popping up saying good morning to everybody. And I think we've just had a couple of thumbs up there as well. So we'll make a start with this morning. So as I said, I'm Gemma McGregor from Provider Development and my colleague Rachel. If you just want to move on to the next slide, Rachel, that'd be great. Thank you. So this is us. This is us. We're also going to turn our cameras off now so that we're not distracting you while you're trying to follow along with the slides. But do be aware that the PowerPoint will be available from the session once we've finished. So you will get a copy of that at the end of the session. Okay, so I'm going to turn my camera off now and we'll make a start. Okay, so we're going to have a look at the outcomes for this morning's session. Okay, so what we're going to attempt to do today is we're going to compare some different question types and their associated assessment objectives. We're going to reflect upon how we can use command verbs in our planning, delivery and formative assessment strategies. We're going to explore some characteristics of an effective extended response answer, and we're going to share some next steps for feedback that supports learning and achievement for your students. Okay, so the next slide is we're going to discuss why we use assessment objectives. So assessment objectives are given in the form of different levels, and I'm sure you're all familiar with AOs 1, 2 and 3. You'll have seen these appear in your exam papers, sample exams, and you'll have also seen these in mark schemes. And really, whatever qualification you're doing, particularly with NCFE, you will see these assessment objectives in those terms. So AO 1, 2 and 3. Now, we can apply these assessment objectives in various ways in our delivery, in our ways that we support our students towards achieving success in their assessments, how we can give feedback, how we can create teaching and learning opportunities in our classrooms, and how we can measure our students' progress in terms of formative assessment or equally their overall performance on a programme of study. So by that, I mean their summative assessment. So we're going to have a look at some command verbs. Now you'll have seen these appear again. You'll see these in questions throughout exam papers. You might hear the term used, but you might not know what kind of command verbs are applied to which kind of questions, or which ones are most likely to be seen within different types of questions. So what you're going to see on screen now, thanks Rachel, is a bit of a table, and it's an attempt to break down a little bit for you where you're likely to see these types of command verbs and what kind of questions you're likely to see at the different assessment objective levels. So as an example, we've got down the AO column there, we've got AOs 1 to 3, and we've also got some example question types. So for example, for AO1, it's very likely that that kind of question is going to be a recall question. So it's going to be likely a multiple choice question. Okay, so your students are expected to recall something. They might have to choose an item from a list. For example, you might have 4 distractors and they might have to identify the correct answer. They might have to give an example of something. They might have to identify something or indicate a choice of something at a very basic level. For AO2, you're likely to see a short answer question. These are slightly different in that it extends the skills slightly. So they might have to label a diagram, they might have to apply a piece of theory, they might have to compare two things, or they might have to give a description of something. But slightly longer answers, so it's not just a recall activity. They're going to have to provide a slightly longer answer for these, and it usually requires a shorter written response. And then we have AO3, and these are the extended response questions. So you often see these at the end of the section on an exam paper, for example. They have a higher mark tariff, and for extended response questions, you're often looking for all three assessment objective levels, so 1 through to 3. So your students might be asked to reflect on something, they might be asked to analyse something, assess two things comparatively to one another, for example, or evaluate the effectiveness of something. But within that AO3 question, that extended response question, the likelihood is they're also going to have to identify something or perhaps describe something as well as those AO3 level skills. Okay, we're moving on. So you might have seen this before. If some of you have done a teacher training qualification, you might have done a PGCE, for example, a diploma. You might have done petals, detals, kettles, or something similar in your journey as qualifying to be a teacher. You might have come across something that looks a little bit like this before. So this is an adaptation of Bloom's taxonomy. Now, if you haven't seen this before, a little bit of background around this. So this was originally created, believe it or not, in 1956 by a guy called Benjamin Bloom. And the idea was that he wanted to categorize these types of thinking skills so that they were standardized across examinations, across teachers and educators, so that they could help classify how our students were working their way through the different types of skills they needed in order to be successful in an examination. Now, this is quite a modern version of Bloom's taxonomy. It has been adapted, you'll be pleased to hear, since 1956, actually several times. And while I haven't got all of them on screen, because there's quite a few adaptations, this one here, and you'll spot the link at the bottom of the page where you can access this. This one includes several different layers of skills, and you can see that I've sort of denoted, I guess, where AO1, AO2 and the AO3 skills sit. It does look quite hierarchical, so it looks like it goes up in order of skill, and all of the Bloom's taxonomy models kind of look like this. As a little caveat to this, when you're using it, I just want to say that although it looks hierarchical and AO3 skills are at the top, that doesn't mean that the AO1 skills and the AO2 skills, so the recall type skills and the application type skills, aren't just as important as those evaluative skills, which are considered higher order thinking skills. They all share, in my opinion, equal importance. Our students need to be able to do them all in order to be successful. But this just kind of gives you an idea of where those skills sit and the kind of skills that they're going to need in order to be able to get those higher marks, particularly for those extended response questions. There is a version of this that was created in 2008 by a guy called Andrew Church, which you might find really interesting if you haven't seen it yet, where he has embedded digital tasks into the taxonomy so that you can apply that in a bit more of a 21st century way in your classroom and look at using some of those kind of digital teaching and learning strategies and assessment strategies. So you can see here, and I won't go through all of them because we do only have limited time this morning, but I will talk through a few. So you can see here that at the bottom where we have those AO1 level skills, remembering and understanding. So can the student recall or remember information? So they might have to recall something, they might have to state something, they might have to create a list. At the understanding level, can the student explain an idea or a concept? So can they describe something to you? So we're back to those short answer questions and those multiple choice questions at AO1 and AO2. But once we reach AO3, this is where students often find it the most tricky to apply those skills. And again, for us as educators and us as teachers, to unpick whether or not they're achieving those higher order skills and whether they're applying those skills to the questions that they're being asked. So we're looking at those analysing, evaluating, and even creative skills at that AO3. So can they argue a point? Can they compare or contrast things? Can they examine something and give a justification for why they have a particular opinion? And can they create something new? Can they share their point of view, and how well can they do that? It's quite a difficult task to do that sometimes as adults, but for younger students, or for a sort of our age range students, that's quite a tall order, isn't it? To be able to present your own point of view and to be able to really justify their opinions and justify why they feel the way they do about a particular topic. So let's move on. Now we're going to look at using assessment objectives, and we're going to look at some examples here. So this is an example of an AO1 type question. Okay, now this comes from a VCERT Model 4 Health and Fitness paper. So we've tried to be quite sort of generic in the examples that we've used this morning so that hopefully everybody can find something that they can relate to. And this is, as I say, it's an anatomy and physiology question, and it comes from a health and fitness paper. So you can see from this question that it's an AO1 question, and it only carries with it 1 mark. We can tell that we only need to give one answer here, don't we? We only need to identify the correct answer. There's 4 possible answers and we need to select one, and your student will have to recall that information. And you'll see by the question that we've got 1 highlighted in bold there, so they know there's 1 mark and 1 answer, and it's a recall answer. Okay, so moving on to AO2, they've identified for AO1, and in AO2, they now need to describe. But not only do they need to describe, they need to describe 2 elements. So there's 4 marks attributed to this question, which comes from a Model 4 engineering paper. And they've got 4 marks to gain, so they need to give 2 elements and a short description of each. So you're going to look at that, aren't you, and think, okay, so they need to give a short description and it's 2 marks per element. Okay, so they're fairly straightforward. As long as the teaching and learning's been covered and our students are quite comfortable with the content of the qualification spec, working towards AO1 and AO2, you know, those higher order thinking skills haven't quite been brought in yet. However, if we move on to AO3, this looks very different. Okay, so students are required to evaluate for this question. And this question comes from an Education and Early Years T-level paper. So this question carries with it 12 marks, plus 3 marks for the quality of written communication. Okay, so we're not just looking at how well the students answered the question here, we're also looking at how well they've presented their answers. So those other kinds of skills that I'm sure you're all familiar with supporting in your classrooms. These are often the most challenging questions for our students, and they're most challenging for our students to answer, but they're also the most challenging for us to mark, I think, and give feedback on. because they cover those skills all the way from AO1 right the way to AO3. So we're going to focus on these for the remainder of the session, I think. So moving forward, if you've got a smartphone and you can scan this QR code, I'd really appreciate it because I'd like to get a bit of an idea of how you guys feel about the different level of questions before we move on. So if you can scan this code, it should take you to a Slido page where you can register. Beth's just popped in the chat. Thank you, Beth. If you can't use the QR code, that's absolutely fine. You're welcome to use the chat. And Beth will be keeping an eye on your responses over there. But hopefully when we move on to the next slide, what I'd like to do is get a bit of a feel for where everybody's at in terms of which questions they think their students find the most challenging. So I'm going to give you a couple of seconds just to scan that QR code, because I know there's quite a lot of us on the call today. If we can get some responses. Okay, so which type of questions do your students find the most challenging? And I don't think I'm going to get much of a surprise, at least I'm hoping I'm not, because it does seem to be historically that students find those extended response questions the most challenging because they have to include all of those different assessment objective levels in one space. And often trying to unpick those for the student is quite a challenge. So what is it the question's asking me to do? Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, everyone in the chat. So extended response question seems to have it for the win. Thankfully, that's what I anticipated, and we're going to focus on those extended response questions for the remainder of the session. Wait and see if we get a few more. Lovely. Thanks, Rachel. Okay, so we're going to focus on extended response questions for that reason. And there's several different types of extended response questions that you might come across in your subject area, okay? And these are on the screen now. So I'm briefly going to talk through these, okay? So extended response questions may take many different forms, and they might align to one specific or multiple areas depending on the command verbs that are used within them. Okay, so the top example we've got here is analytical. So these kinds of questions tend to present students with scenarios, case studies, and they prompt students to provide reasoned arguments or a solution to a problem. So some problem solving activities. You might also come across evaluative extended response questions. These require students to weigh different perspectives or theories within a subject area. But the key point here is that they really need to be able to justify their opinions, which can be really tricky. And the example that you've just seen a few slides ago from that education and early years paper is an example of an evaluative extended response question. It might be an applicative extended response question, and this is where students are asked to apply their knowledge to real world situations and explain potential implications or outcomes. So if your students are working within a vocational subject, for example, these are quite common because they need to apply those to their own practice or their own area of study, whether that's engineering, whether that might be health and fitness, whether that's food and cookery. They have to apply those to real life scenarios. We've then got comparative extended response questions. Now, these ask students to compare and contrast different theories, methodologies, or approaches. So they may be asked to compare two things and choose the one they think is the most effective, for example, or they may be asked to compare and give strengths and limitations for one or both of those approaches or methodologies, as an example. And the last one is significance extended response questions. And these prompt students to discuss the significance or relevance of a certain concept or an idea within their subject. So that might be for education, for example, that might be some legislation around safeguarding. In engineering, it might be some documentation used for site surveys, for example. For health and fitness, it might be how they use questionnaires, fitness questionnaires, in order to provide an accurate fitness plan for a client. For interactive media, it could be how do they use design principles or different sets of design principles, and can they discuss their relevance in context. So mastering extended response questions really isn't just about knowing the content. It's also about being able to think critically, analyze information effectively, and communicate their understanding clearly. So not just in their written communication, in terms of how well their spelling, grammar, and punctuation present themselves, but also how they formulate their answer, how it's structured, and whether or not they're really forming those reasoned arguments or reasoned judgments behind their choices and behind their answer. Okay, so the first thing we need to get our students to do is make sure that they're answering the questions in full. Okay, now this is a task we can do ourselves as well as teachers. So we can look at those sample papers online and look at examples and think, okay, so what is it our students are being asked to really do in this question? Because the chances are, because it's an extended response question, they're going to need to do quite a lot. So it's going to involve unpicking that question and working out exactly what it is they need to do. So this is the question from earlier on. So the education and early years core paper question. So can you think, just in your head, how do you think students would achieve higher marks with this kind of extended response question? And how can we unpick what they need to do in order for them to answer it completely, in its completeness? So we worked out that this was an evaluative question. But we now need to know, what is it that we need to see from that? So using those example papers, checking out our chief examiner's reports, what do they need to do? So firstly, in this example, students will be expected to evaluate the effectiveness of this guidance. They then need to explain how it informs practice. They need to give strengths. They need to identify limitations. And lastly, the most complicated part is they need to give a reasoned justification around its effectiveness. So in that one question, we've identified all of those elements that need to be tackled in order to achieve sort of the highest level marks for that question. It's really tricky to give an evaluative or a reasoned judgment if you're not used to doing this. And some methods you can use to do that would be really encouraging discussion around these kinds of topics. So this question, for example, is around a piece of guidance, safeguarding guidance in education. So really get your students looking at these questions and looking at the kind of guidance, kind of legislation, or the kind of documents they're going to be using as part of their programme, and really pulling them apart. So they could have discussion in class to support, what do we need to do in this question? Get them to look at the questions together or with yourselves in a group. Another nice way of looking at this is asking the students to create their own questions. So using some sample questions as a model, get them to create questions for each other that involve these kinds of skills. So they're writing questions for each other in their subject area. So that not only helps them understand these kinds of questions in terms of what's involved in them, but also one of the greatest ways of learning something is to share it with others. So if they can create a question themselves, pass it to a peer, get their peer to answer the question and then mark it, they'll really be able to understand how these questions are put together and ultimately how they can best answer them. You also need to think, we've seen there's 12 marks plus 3 marks for the quality of written communication. So how is their written communication? Can you read their work? Is it legible? Are they using the right language, key language for their subject area? Is their spelling, grammar and punctuation going to afford them those 3 marks? Do you need to do some additional support, some additional sessions around that? Have they followed a logical sequence? All of these things will help you when it comes to marking these questions and how you're going to support your students moving forward to get more marks on these types of questions in exams. So we've worked out what we need to see, but now moving on, what do we think the examiners need to see? So what I've done on this slide for you is I've pulled apart some chief examiners reports, and these are across a range of different qualifications. But what was interesting was there's a lot of commonality between the different qualifications for extended response questions, and that's across qualifications at both level 2, particularly, and level 3. And these are the things that you can kind of treat as key takeaways for the things that chief examiners are pulling out of responses when they do their examining at the end of the exam season. So I'll briefly talk through each of them, and then we'll move on to how we can give our students actionable feedback in order to make sure that they're achieving what the examiners like to see. So first of all, we've got understanding of concepts. So extended response questions require students to demonstrate a thorough understanding. That might be of theories, principles relevant to the question, and this is where your students can really showcase their solid foundation of knowledge in their own subject matter, whatever that may be. As I say, these are common themes across all subjects. Critical thinking skills. So can they analyse information? Can they unpick different arguments? Can they evaluate different perspectives? And how do they challenge that if they disagree with somebody else or even with yourself? And can they demonstrate a logical approach to answering and solving the problem, solving the question or meeting the brief? In terms of application and knowledge, practical application and theoretical knowledge is crucial for extended response questions. Students should be able to apply their understanding in that real world scenario, demonstrating relevance and the applicability of their knowledge. So how can they relate that to their subject? How could it be used in practice, and why is that a valid method to use? Effective communication. This is really important. So are they clear? Are they coherent? Can you follow their argument? Do they use the right language? Are they using the language that appears in the qualification spec, for example? Are they structuring it well enough that they can show how well they understand the topic? And depth of analysis. Extended response questions often require students to look at some quite complex issues and provide some insightful analysis. This can be tricky if it's not practiced. So looking at these things and really getting discussion, debates, getting your students talking about these theories, these ideas, and these methodologies is really key in your classroom activities. Can they give a well-supported conclusion? Make sure that your students are saying, this is what I believe and this is why. It's not good enough to just say, I think this, but can they really tell you why they think that and what's led them to believe that? Synthesis of information. Can they use various sources and pull ideas together to develop an argument? And where are they getting those sources from? Are they accurate? Are they up to date? To encourage research activities and get your students looking at research around their chosen topic and subject. Can they give evidence and justification? Have they got any data that they can remember that they can use in an extended response question? Relevance and focus. Don't ramble. Can you keep your students on track? They've only got so much space and they're only going to get 12 marks. So can they stay focused on their topic at hand? It's really essential to maintain that focus and address the question. So back to that unpicking, what's it actually asking me? Clarity and coherence. Is their writing organised? Does it have an introductory section? Does it have a development of an argument and a conclusion at the end? And have they checked that grammar for that written communication? Have they checked their punctuation? A piece of writing that's written well will always score higher with examiners if they can follow that and they know what it is that the student is trying to get across. They can really demonstrate a comprehensive understanding by following these key points. But if they follow them all, so if they've unpicked the question, they know what we as teachers are expecting of them at that AO3 assessment objective, and we know what the chief examiners are expecting of them. What do we do next? So how do we feed that forward and how do we make that work for our students and help them level up in terms of leveling up those higher order thinking skills, so those AO3 skills. So moving on, we're going to have a look at actionable feedback technique. So you now know what it is that your students need to produce. You've looked at those chief examiner reports and you know what AO3 looks like. You're now going to feed that back to your students. So you're going to look at their work and you're going to say, right, what do we need to do? We've set the expectations and what are we going to do to identify gaps and help you as a student move up to that next level? Actionable feedback is a really good way to do this. And there's some key sort of bite-sized terms on the screen there about effective actionable feedback. It's got to be practical, it's got to be achievable for the student, and it needs to be specific. It's no good giving feedback that's really general. It has to support their improvement. So if they're really good at something, give them that positive reinforcement. Tell them this is wonderful, this is great. However, we need to work on this moving forward. Is it timely? Have you got enough time to support them with those skills before those exams roll around? So planning that in advance, which we'll look at shortly. Can you get that done in time? Accountable. Are the students accountable for making those changes and making those adjustments to their work so that they can level up? Be constructive and keep the feedback going. Keep it continuous. Every formative assessment activity that you do, keep it coming and make it measurable. And by measurable, I mean, how can you measure it moving forward? Have they got any distance travelled? Can you see how far they've come? You can use that Bloom's taxonomy that we talked about earlier to help you plan aims and objectives for your sessions that incorporate...
Sorry, I've got to leave. That's a fire alarm.
Oh, no problem. Goodness me, I hope I don't have one of those. How you can use those Bloom's taxonomy objectives, those command verbs, to plan those into your sessions to help your students level up. So on the next slide, there are just a few examples of language you can use for that actionable feedback. I won't go through all of them, and do remember you will get access to these slides after this morning's session. The key one that I'd like you to take a look at is under suggestions for improvement, and it's that bottom one. So remember when we looked at those questions, those exam questions, and we qualified how many answers the students needed to provide, that was really clear for them, wasn't it? It was really easy for them to go, okay, I only need one answer for this question. It's an AO1 question, 1 mark, and I need to give 1 example. If you follow that format in your aims and objectives for your students, that's a really, really good way of making those aims and objectives actionable for your students, and it's a great way of you holding them accountable for their own development. So can you add 3 links between theory and how it impacts on your practice in your next piece of writing? So the next time you do an activity and you give that to your students, they know they need to be doing those 3 things, and you can quite easily look at those and go, yes, they've done it, or no, they haven't, and why not? Okay. Moving forward. So next steps. So this screen here that we're going to move on to is just a little bit about curriculum planning. And again, I won't go through the whole slide, but you can have access to this after. And this is about how you can use example command verbs and tasks and questioning techniques in order to get your students working towards those AO3 skills and developing those extended response question answers. So we've got analysing, evaluating and creating. So there's some examples of the command verbs there you can use. So categorise, contrast, classify. And example tasks you could use might be create a diagram, write a diary entry, or do a collection of research, for example. And you'll see the questions, the example question types, are quite challenging. However, it really gets your students thinking about how they can put forward their own opinions. In their previous education, for example, as they've worked their way through perhaps GCSEs or level 1 programmes, they may not have been asked for their opinions quite so much, or asked to think about how things impact on one another. And these example questions are a really good way of getting that into your sessions. So again, for evaluating, they might have to justify something. So you ask them to judge the value of something. Do you think this is a good or a bad thing? But remember, at this level, they're looking at, yes, it's good, but I'm able to tell you why I think it's good. And these are the students that are getting the highest marks in these extended response questions. So these are just a few suggestions. And again, as I say, you will get access to these slides. So moving on then, we've now got a quick QR code scan again. And what I'd like you all to do is I've put a few examples on the screen there of formative assessment strategies, but I would think that you've all got your own, some that you've tried, you've tested, that you think are great. And what I'd like you to do is scan the QR code if you can. Again, if not, just use the chat and pop some suggestions on the screen. So as you type, they'll appear on the screen and then they'll be available for everybody to access at the end. Mock exams is a great one. Everybody uses them and they are really valuable. They're particularly valuable if you're using them alongside those chief examiner reports and the marking grids. Padlets, lovely. Peer feedback. Peer feedback is a great one to use because peer feedback not only gets them looking at each other's work, but it really encourages discussion. Book Buddy Boss, I'm interested in that one. I don't know what that one is. If you'd like to pop in the chat what that is. Kahoot, we've just had in the chat. Kahoot's wonderful. You can create quizzes and online activities using Kahoot. Learner statements, mini whiteboards. Brilliant. These are great. Thanks, Beth. Keep an eye. Microsoft Forms. Yes, what's an exit ticket? If anybody would like to pop that in the chat, I'd like to hear that. These are great. Fantastic. Verb descriptive guides. Yes, getting the students unpicking those verbs and looking at what they really mean. So from an e-learning perspective, I really like the practical suggestions covered. That's fantastic. Remember, looking at e-learning and pulling in those digital ideas as well. You know, we're all living in the 21st century. We've got AI now, whether you love it or you hate it. So please do look at that revised version of Bloom's Taxonomy with Andrew Church's additions, because there's some really good e-learning formative assessment strategies on there, like podcasts, doing a vlog or a blog, micro teachers, answering a question to allow you to leave the lesson is an exit ticket. Thank you, Sharon. Some brilliant ones. Thank you for taking part in that. That means that when we all leave today, we've all got access to these on screen, and it will continue to run in the background as we move on to close the session. So this is just some further reading. So this is some stuff I've used in HE in a former life. Some really good books around assessing and encouraging those higher order thinking skills, those unpicking those AO3 level skills. And the link at the bottom there is the link to that Bloom's Taxonomy that I used. But as I say, you will find there's lots of different versions of that online. So find one that works for you. There's lots of different versions of that. So please do access those in your own time. The slides that are coming up now, thanks Rachel, you'll see that on this slide there's one more QR code. So we'd really appreciate your feedback from this whistle-stop tour of assessment objectives this morning. I appreciate there's been a lot, but we do hope that you've gained something from it. And just to make you aware as well that Rachel and I will be doing another short session, a short recorded session around using Bloom's Taxonomy in your own lessons and how you can use those to support your students. If you could scan this QR code, you'll also get access to our digital badge for this morning's session. So once you've completed the form, you'll see there's an option for a digital credential, and you'll get a lovely badge that looks just like that one to say that you've attended this morning. You will have to give permission for that so that our third party can keep your details in order to issue your badge. But it's mapped along to the ETF and DFE professional standards, so it's a really nice one to have. We've really enjoyed this morning, or I have. I hope you've taken something away from it, but please do reach out and get in touch with me if you'd like to ask any questions about this morning's session, or indeed if you'd like us to run another session around assessment objectives and how you can use those to support your students moving forward. If you can't access the QR code, I think Beth has very kindly popped the link in the chat as well if you want to access it that way. She has. Thank you, Beth. Pleasure. So on the slide there, you'll see there's my email address if you'd like to contact me directly, and our provider development team email address in the event you'd like to contact either myself, Rachel, or Beth. So thank you so much for joining us on our crazy whistle-stop tour of assessment objectives, and we've had a lovely morning. Thank you for joining us.